Some of you may be wondering about how the curatorial process worked. As you know, for those of you who are in Sri Lanka, Fariba visited Sri Lanka in July and met a lot of the local individuals. And at the same time, I have worked here since 2012. In small ways, never to do a big program. So I knew quite a lot of friends, and due to different programs I've done also in Europe, in Berlin in particular, met a lot of Indian as well as Pakistani artists, and we invited all of them to come together today, and in a kind of intergenerational way, as we said. And the process was to try to bring everybody together without being too strict, but actually just talking to them. So I talked to everybody on the phone, on Zoom, for maybe an hour each time, just to get a sense of each person's interest, and then to develop the panels from there. I mean, of course, there was some initial idea that I had, but at the same time, it was through fairly long conversations with the 20 over individuals here, beginning with usually with 1 hour, and sometimes, and from there I would take notes and then develop a title. But that title is obviously not the title of their talk. It's more like a title from speaking with them, getting a sense that, okay, this is what it's roughly about. So we didn't really ask for papers, and of course, you know, maybe in the next the Biennial Symposiums, there will be formal printing or publishing of these papers. But there is also a very strong sense that I have of how artists and cultural workers work. I mean, we are not academics, but we are really living the practice. So there is a very strong sense that that it's about not fixing to the very last moment. Like, for example, Shahidul, after I had a conversation with him, the whole thing erupted at the Photography Biennale, and guess what? His talk changed completely, but it's still fitting the title of Truth to Power. So it's a kind of very organic way to try to find a way where we cross in a transdisciplinary way all these different genres, and to curate in a way which is not to fix, but the curation as a process, curation as a slow burn, and to try to move towards a way in which individuals' passions and individuals' different practices are slowly burning and coming together, and not to insist on being too rigid. Of course, this means that our video technician was tearing his hair out because nobody sent in the materials until the last minute. And so anyway, we're now here into the afternoon, and I think that all my blah blah is now settling everyone down. And now we begin with the afternoon, and we begin with futurities, failures and futurities. So over to Avni.
Hello, everybody. It's not the best to speak right after lunch. I know it's nap time. I'll keep it short. So I come to this matter at a time when decolonization is really in a frenzy. You know, the international circuit was producing new programming, game labs, exhibitions, music concerts, lots of new publications, collaterals. South-South solidarities were being forged around the possibility of decolonizing. And then the market appropriates everything, from perfume bottles to healthcare to yoga gurus. And here begins the decline of something that was highly potent, promising, discursive realm of decoloniality. It had just begun to gather fatigue when a certain dangerous someone obsessed with space travel came around on X and claimed that decolonization, using the word decolonization, implies genocide. The powers that be are reinstated, the very same structure that their cultural wings were asking to decolonize. coloniality, once again, has taken center stage, albeit its manifestations look marginally different this time. And the world really nods in agreement. While decolonization has been concerned with a number of paradigms, the one site that I'm particularly embroiled in happens to be the museum. This proposition today is as much a manifesto for the future as it is a reflection of the past on the institutions that have recorded history and disseminated it through language and representation, or rather misrepresentation. Both these methods that have in their oeuvre been largely exclusive, seldom emancipatory, never transformative. It is needless to say that the museum has been a colonial enterprise in its approach, in its scale, in its affect. But its legacy within the post-colonial has been no different either. Its post-coloniality barely ever arrived. If at all, a restoration of an internal colonialism that shaped even more vehemently, say for example in the Indian context, how Indianness would transpire in an homogeneous national imagination. So the Indian state, time and again, has actively mediated public discourse through cultural intervention, while a cultural policy has always been on the anvil after several advisory committees formed and disbanded. This may be for the best. For a diverse, itinerant, and inclusive cultural policy is an unimaginable artifact for the Indian state to produce that has been preoccupied with producing a singular narrative of nationhood, when none really actually exists. For a society in constant flux, can the museum afford a position of a politics followed by an induced redundancy? The traditional museum has served as a place of preserving artifact of value derived from a diverse range of contexts: zoological, geological, botanical, archaeological, as well as art, architectural, or historical contexts, amongst others, as a result of which historians and scholars are able to build narratives of the past through admissible evidence. At this juncture, a reading of the relationship between those artifacts that have assumed value, largely through hegemonic societal structures, and their transformation into artifacts as legitimate evidence needs to be examined closely. The artifact that has historically been used as evidence has been selected from the repertoire of the conquest, external or internal. The nexus between history writing as a knowledge system, museums, and the state, when laid bare, can be ruptured by a different kind of evidence. The museum, therefore, in the future, will necessarily need to shift the very nature of this evidence itself. In jurisprudence, evidence could be testimony, documentary, or physical that is presented to support an assertion, each more fragile than the other. These forms of evidence are conceptually sacrosanct, but are greatly compromised. And we see this compromise every day, in the courts, outside courts. In the case of violence, the admissible evidence could be the following. It could be the testimony of a witness, it could be a weapon of violence, or it could be the body that endured the violence. All of these are increasingly vulnerable to manipulation or disappearance, of which we have seen various examples in the recent past. Therefore, within the realm of history, these forms of evidence may not be adequate at all to encompass large sections of society that have been systematically denied a historical consciousness in the first place. What then would be the form of evidence to legitimize histories of the oppressed people, to propose diversity or inclusivity within the present museum structure as we know it? It may be too little, too late, sufficient, nor just. What then would be the role of the museum when the state is in denial of its own amnesia? Can the museum offer itself to be the site of a generative evidence that restores and reconstructs history, challenges the narratives of grandeur and antiquity of the Brahminical nationalist state? So to build historical temper, one would certainly need to prepare ourselves to make rigorous connections between the events of the past and their implications on the future. But to do so, we would probably need to first build evidence that is rooted in experience, however temporal it may seem, of those that have been deliberately forgotten and erased by the state and those favored by it. Evidence which is rooted in experiences of denial and exclusion, of inequality and violence, that may take the form of newer aesthetic practices, a materiality of the everyday, as well as a culture of emanating from the collective memory of pain and anger. And I'm speaking today really when I'm emerging from 10 years of running a museum called the Conflictorium, which is a museum of conflict both in Ahmedabad in Gujarat and in Raipur in Chhattisgarh. And so while I am speculating this museum, some of these have been desires to be able to make happen. Some were too far in the horizon to be able to reach. Some continue to remain dreams of what one could make possible. But the formulation of the museum, therefore, in the future, cannot be derived only from ideological or aesthetic positions, but we'll have to see this position permeate into an operational museology. It is the day-to-day operations of a museum, its regulatory structures, its institutional protocols of control, its prescribed etiquette for spectatorship, its lexicon and vestimentary codes that will have to transform to include and comfort large sections of society. The silences of long and endless corridors will have to protest dominant idioms in language. The vocabulary of the art museum will have to recognize and articulate a common aspiration for society. The nature of the artifact may not necessarily be rooted in materiality or accept word as evidence, but we'll have to find methods of displaying a temporal, performative archive. The traditional museum has demonstrated that the two spatial components of the museum, that is the back of the room and the front of the room, have disproportionate ratios. The collections are larger in volume than display. A museum of the future may need to reimagine the collection itself and its form. The repository of artifacts may be easily available and rampant in access, and hence may not be precious at all. Although its framing, its labels might need exquisite forms of empathy. The museum will have to prepare itself to be a repository of self-assertive political and aesthetic practices, committed to marginality as a manner of imagining society itself, a potential site to undo a prolonged protected ignorance. I'm taking this from Alone, of centuries forming impenetrable networks of historical narratives. Its futurity will arrive when the processes through which narratives are formed will be constructed by those that are the protagonists within them. Materiality on one hand and orality on the other are often posited as contentious. The archival or authorized has garnered more legitimacy over remembrance. But a matter of methodology, we know that the processes through which historians secure access to pasts is highly vexed, as is the association of memory with record. The museum may be imagined as a space that affords a play with time. Its future may lie in the everydayness of this colossal tragedy and the ordinariness of triumph. The time that the museum wishes to collect may be in the future, in a possible infinity, for the evidence of citizenship lies in the everyday. Ultimately, the museum is a civic structure. Its relationship and accountability to citizenry is essential. It is within the same citizenry that the museum may have a role to play vis-à-vis justice. It is by no means in competition or even an alternate to formal justice systems, but the museum does have a potential to formulate an alternative legality. The relationship of legality and justice remains fraught. Within our colonial inheritance is also the bequeathal of law, whose relationship with justice is increasingly adversarial. What is legal may not be just. What is just is not necessarily legal. The Museum of the Future could recognize and operate across these fault lines. Within legal frameworks, the onus of producing evidence is mostly on the victims of violence. In the case of structural violence, women, trans, and oppressed communities bear this burden. Untouchability has been deemed illegal in India, but is practiced rampantly in the country, in fact, in more and more sophisticated forms today. This rather displaced responsibility needs restoration more so if historical consciousness pervades a citizenry of which the museum is a vibrant participant. The shared responsibility of producing evidence within the museum translates into a shared commitment towards justice-based cultural production. We have known for too long that freedom arrives only when freedom belongs to everyone. How could the museum imbibe this understanding and transform its spectatorship into an actively engaged, justice-based culture? Therefore then, how does one begin to construct a museum without conquest, or without the reenactment of violence or victimhood for the consumption of a visitor? How does a museum become before a collection even does? How does one reimagine the very category of the museum while retaining its ramifications? The only possibility of attempting these questions came from the inherent ability of space to be able to be a sensorial experience. It is possible that this kind of audacity was available to me since I arrived at the museum from design thinking, which upholds prototype within the realm of praxis as the foremost way of knowing, followed by iteration as a method. So you don't arrive at it from knowing well, you actually arrive at it from not knowing at all. I assume it would be difficult to make gaping mistakes and rectify them if I arrived at it through the curatorial or historical first. It meant that operationally, the museum's primary role was to listen to its neighborhood, to its participants, to its public. So the conflictorium that becomes my entry point in being able to make this inquiry is then a museum, if at all, on the path of becoming and still becoming. It may remain in a continual strife of articulating its practice and claiming the nomenclature of the museum, colonial as it is, each changed by the other. Within this struggle, it hopes to identify most essentially its galleries and buildings, its artifacts and methods, its archives and histories, its evidence and culture, its participants and people as thriving ecologies of care with a conviction that that is a practice of care that restores justice. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. Today I'm not going to share any slides with you because of many reasons. And this is the first time I'm doing a talk without visuals. This is about a community archaeology project we started in Jaffna. 3 decades of civil war in Sri Lanka came to an end by the government's crucial military initiative that killed thousands of Tamil civilians and displaced hundreds of thousands without solving the cause of the war, which is the ethnic conflict. Further, 14 years have been passed since the end of the war, but still the families that handed over their relatives to the armed forces in the final days of war waiting for their return. For many who were displaced, unable to resettle in their ancestral villages due to the forced occupation of private lands by the armed forces under the name of high security zones. End of war gave immense possibility to rebuild a just society through the process of reconciliation and learning from the violent past. But war triumphalism and majoritarianism never permit this to realize. Sri Lankan state resurrect its war machinery to engage in a psychological war with minority communities, like complete denial of rights of Tamils to commemorate their loved ones killed during the war in public, anti-Muslim riots, attacks on churches, and evacuation of minorities from farmland and settlement areas in the name of Buddhist archaeology and forest conservation. The land that was choken with a human blood in 30 years of war is now being marked by the war victory memorials of military, newly erected Buddha statues, and Buddhist temples. On the other hand, these are the proclamation of Sri Lankan Buddhist nationalists in larger claim on the land. More than 30 years of Buddhist sites, more than 30 Buddhist sites were erected in non-singular Buddhist villages and towns in the Tamil-speaking north and east after the war ended. Over 20 non-Buddhist religious sites were destroyed or under dispute due to the newly built Buddhist sites. Some of the controversial archaeological sites are appropriated as singular Buddhist sites with the help of Archaeological Department of Government of Sri Lanka by violating the court orders. Archaeology, history, and heritage have been played actors in the creation of the modern Sri Lanka and division social and political structure. As Spencer notes, the war which has been fought between the armed Tamil separatists and the Sri Lankan dominated government has been accompanied by the rhetorical war fought over archaeological sites, place name etymologies, and the interpretation of ancient inscriptions. Yet, we also know from the history and archaeology that the population of Sri Lanka was complex, multifaceted, and not the simple religious ethno-dichotomy completely presented in the recent time. For example, the reach of Buddhism from North Indian origin deep into the Peninsula India gave rise to the significant Buddhist Tamil community in the first millennium. Thus, presence of Buddhist remains does not automatically equate to singular occupation as assumed and used to justify singular primacy claimed today. Heritage is a prominent feature of Sri Lankan national identity. The
island has UNESCO's 5 cultural World Heritage Sites, and these underpin economically important cultural tourism. Internationally renowned sites such as Anuradhapura, Sigiriya, Polonnaruwa, and Dambulla are elite, monumental, and linked with state-backed narratives that support the preeminence of Buddhist Sinhalese royal dynasties. This focus on elite sites of early historical periods linked to Sinhala Buddhist power offer a large monocultural version of the past that eclipses the rich and diverse heritage of the more recent histories and has fueled the ethnic division and race nationalism explored above. All archaeological sites and many heritage sites fall under the control of Government Department of Archaeology, which is in charge with excavation, maintenance, and protection of Sri Lanka's archaeological heritage. The department was interested only in highlighting the Buddhist monuments and reconstructing them. Today, the department is responsible for over 250,000 archaeological sites. That many of these sites, living religious sites of pilgrimage and worship, is significant added to complication in their management and presentation. In addition, unchecking and provocative appropriation of Buddhist clergy and the nationalist activists of ritual and religious sites, including very minor forgotten location, using archaeological finding to justify claims, represent further politicization of heritage. In many countries, archaeology is generally viewed as a largely positive endeavor, a subject that enhances society through new discoveries in the field and new insights into past. This is not the case, however, in Sri Lanka, where archaeology is heavily invested in the making of Sinhala Buddhist majoritarianism and as a weapon used against the minorities to make them homeless. Further, established bias favor of the elite monumental archaeology and heritage of the majority, which largely marginalized other forms of archaeological heritages. In this presentation, I outlined the development of a new archaeology and heritage project as a response to this predicament, which focused on a series of collaborative workshops held in Jaffna, hosted by the Arts Faculty of University of Jaffna. This workshop was used to test the potential for archaeology and heritage to foster post-war healing by supporting affirmation of identity, sense of place, and community. Against this background, 2 senior archaeologists from University of Exeter and University of Leicester, UK, together with academics and the students of University of Jaffna and members of the local community, developed a project through a series of workshops and field visits focusing on localized archaeologies of the recent past of Jaffna Peninsula that allow us to explore the rich and diverse evidence of everyday that firmly rooted in place. Objective of these projects are undertake the first historical archaeological survey characterizing the socio-cultural and material landscape of everyday life over past 500 years. Explore the value and meaning of heritage in minority and post-conflict communities. Co-create new ways of recording and presenting heritage with local communities. Our work applies historical archaeological approaches in 2 broader fields. The first is the built environment, including administrative and religious structures, building associated with European contact and economic activity, and the domestic and mundane. The second is the world of artisanship, particularly focused on landscape and costly activity. This archaeological heritage of the later historical period forms the physical fabric of the village and the town environment today, and merge with the social memory and material culture of numerous communities. Multiple religious faiths and ethnicities have long coexisted across the island, and this reality lying below the state-endorsed narrative of division, overdue for recognition as shared heritage. Rather than being constrained by the systematic and standardized archaeological fieldwork methodology, and to optimize the data type captured, we adapted an opportunistic and responsive investigation style of fieldworking. The landscape biography might include geographical coordinates, notes, drawings, sketches, and photographs on topographical and vegetational features, movable and non-movable material, culture, and informal human interaction. Although along with field surveys, qualitative research involved community members and local interlocutors will be fundamental. This will comprise formal, semi-formal interviews, generating oral recording and narrative notes. Distinctive features and structures encountered, such as building, traditional boats, or maritime apparatus, provide opportunity for more sustained specialist recordings, such as measured plan of buildings and photogrammetry capable photographs of boats. Ultimately, this will be compiled using digital mapping techniques so that place can be analyzed through these multiple layers of reporting. As a group with mixed experience and skill, archaeologists, historians, geographers, economists, sociologists, art historians, visual and performing artists, we also wanted to pay an attention to the dynamics of our group interaction and how this affect what was deemed important and thus recorded. Through these multiple layers of community engagement and interdisciplinary dialogue, we have trialed and will further develop a social science-driven walking research method distinct from archaeological field reconnaissances as an approach to unsettled conflict-related archaeology and memory. The practice of open-air walking and talking allow participants the freedom of express or distance from ideas, views, and experience specific to the place or communities. Thank you.
Hi, I don't know if you can see me. But anyway. Thank you for your time. So I'm going to share a little bit from, I'm going to give a little bit of a snapshot, I guess, but with an acknowledgement of when we're talking about the context in which we're working. Keng Sen put the word silencing in there, and I think that's the acknowledgement with which I'd like to start the presentation. So, in Nepal, we live in an extremely divisive society. It's very divided. All the issues around our own ways in which caste has played out, within the way we think about ethnicities, within the way we think about gender, sexuality. Caste is kind of something that runs through everything and also not talked about. So with that acknowledgement, I'd like to start. Does the video play or it doesn't play? It doesn't play, okay, that's okay. So there was a video here where Pranav, one of our artists at a residency, he had done this beautiful, small, very zoomed in images of a woman who was weaving. And I kind of wanted to begin with that because this particular sharing that I'm doing today is from the perspective of kind of the precarious position of teaching. And when you're in a kind of setting where you're supposed to teach, what do you do? Because you're kind of working with people who, what is our goal here? And using this as a metaphor. So we're working with people, and our main focus is on the hands, is on the making. And whoever we work with in a teaching setting, and in a learning space, there's the person who's doing the learning. So they're the ones hopefully making, and they're actually weaving their own lives. But we're all kind of situated in these long webs of time. you know, and there's a lot of stories that people come with into an educational space. And a lot of the times we as teachers don't have access to those stories. So, you know, there's a lot of silence in terms of the way in which language works, the way in which, you know, materiality works, the way in which bodies kind of move in a space, and the kind of long histories of time that sometimes when you're in the process of making, when you're weaving, you know, these long strings sometimes tear, they wear off. Sometimes the strands go crazy and you have to find a way to put them back together. But each person in a learning space has their own way in which they weave, even if we're all part of the same loom. So just go with me with the metaphor for now, at this point. So right now, I'm sharing work that it's not just my work, but it's a kind of web of artists and teachers and, you know, young people that we work with and in different parts of Nepal. So I'd like you to keep in mind that in a learning space, the person who's actually doing the learning, right, is coming with all their senses. So we're talking about children, but then there's the teachers who are supposed to be designing the spaces. And, you know, what kind of awareness are they coming with? So we're also working and thinking about teachers. And we're also thinking about artists. And mainly the work that we're doing in this is the web that I'm speaking of is from a particular institution that we've created together. It's called Srijanalaya. And in Srijanalaya, the main focus and center that we're placing is artists. And so this is the work of Sanjeev Maharjan. This was right after the earthquake. And we went to a place, a village that we were invited by another artist, Toz Gurung. And it's right at the epicenter. It's in Kyatsok. And Sanjeev had decided that he was only going to work with whatever was available there. And he was only going to work with these kinds of, these action verbs almost, like, you know, with digging, cutting. So we took tools, but we didn't take anything other than tools. And he decided that he was going to build with the young people there. This was right after the earthquake, just a few months after, and this village had been pretty much collapsed. All the infrastructure they had built across many years had been destroyed. And so he had built a new village, and he asked them, what would you like in the village? It was a very simple question. But what happened across several days is these young people actually discussed it, thought about it, made it, and then it was located in almost like a valley space. So the whole community, because there was nothing you could do, it was right after the earthquake, was just sitting almost in this arena and watching them build this new village. And they wrote about it and they shared it. So this is the kind of work that we've been doing, is the idea of what can artists do as, you know, in this educational space. What is it that artists can bring when we're trying to think about what kinds of histories and stories, in fact, that we can access? So here, the students were actually making stories with an artist through the artist's methodology itself. And things like, you know, really simple things like how do you actually, in an extremely sanitized space like a classroom, where the walls don't really speak or reflect or represent the people who are in the classroom, what do you do in those kinds of spaces? And it was kind of simple things like just bring an object from the home. And so here, you know, Sunita had brought this object and the students were drawing it. And then we realized over time that this one object actually represents a particular trade route in the Kerung, so between Tibet and India. I mean, so through all the way to India, but through Kathmandu, the valley, that actually this jewelry is only made in Patan. So this is actually much closer to the border in the north. But one object itself can hold so many histories that if you actually start bringing these objects in classroom spaces, you can actually create a lot of inquiry. And you have someone else here who himself is a Dalit man who makes all of the tamang instruments that are used in the monasteries. So, you know, really, who are the makers? So not just contemporary artists. Here, this was Sanjeev's, but really thinking about in the communities we're going to, who are the makers there? You know, and what kind of histories get brought up in those spaces? And here you have a collaboration. So, you know, an object like the tungna, which is played by the Tamang community, in Nepal, you know, Kanakji was talking about the need for porous borders. But in fact, like even in one community, there's some very strict borders. We're a very segregated community. So it's interesting how classroom spaces, while they're very sanitary, are actually places where people from different communities come to study together. And so you bring an object like the tungna, and from the community, different people who play it. And suddenly people who are Tamang and non-Tamang are playing the instrument, and usually women are not allowed to play it or don't play it. So what ended up happening is in this process of the workshop, you actually have different people playing the instrument. And Agrim is actually working on evolving the instrument as well. He's been designing and making it. So these are 3 very different instruments that were played in one space in the community. So while we work with artists and thinking about broadening the definition of the artists, we're also thinking about the teachers, is what I was mentioning in the beginning. So how do we create places where the teachers can have the time and place to experiment and think for themselves about where they are? So we do a lot of work where, you know, different artists come and work with teachers and students. So I'm just going to show you a few images that go along those lines, and really trying to empower the teachers to realize that they are also from their own communities. But if you're doing portraiture work with students, how do the teachers themselves also make portraits? And here, this was a workshop where teachers were in the process of working with the artists. They realized that they're the ones who know where the white clay is, where the red clay is, where the black clay is. And they actually made their own pigments, and they actually produced their own paints and created their own images. So, you know, kind of also empowering the teachers themselves to create that kind of a space. And here, another aspect of the work that we do is around where are the stories. So if we're trying to access stories, you know, a lot of the way in which Nepal is the fabric right now is there's a lot of people's livelihoods and lifestyles have been erased or are changing very, very rapidly. So in Gatlang, which is also close to the Kerung, so the northern parts of the trade route that would go into Kathmandu, this particular village is known for being the main herders in that area. But now the government lands, or the way that the government has structured community forests, so whatever was community lands are now more community forests, and actually people who were herding don't have access to those spaces anymore. So they were telling us that within a few years, they won't be able to continue that kind of livelihood anymore, which also has meant that a lot of the young people who used to herd and hear stories about their communities, when they were young and with their elderly, they would go herding very close by. That time period was when they would share stories. So those moments are no longer, it's not possible anymore. So a lot of the students actually didn't know stories, but they worked with some artists. They went to look for some stories, and they actually performed them with the whole community around them. But in the face of this kind of erasure, what do we do? And one of the platforms that we've found is this idea of picture books. You know, so Sanjeev here, while he was on a residency, he decided that, you know, what is the documenting for? You know, what is the point of all this? He spent a month there, and then what? You know, so a lot of the work that he did afterwards was conceptualizing this storybook with Yukta. And now, hopefully this will be published soon, but this process, that all the stories that he was hearing when he was there, the kinds of process around weaving. You know, and this is Meme Dungo, and Meme Dungo was one of the few people in the village who could just size you up. He could look at you and say, okay, he would know exactly how to build, how to make you a sholdo. So this is a sholdo. He would know how to make you a sholdo that just fit you just right. You know, and he's actually passed away recently. And here you have Suman Maharzan, who worked on a story by Durga Lal Shrestha, who's part of the Nepal Bhasa language movement. And, you know, this is a song. It's Kune Suwala, Dapla Kya, Tsuya Wala, Buena Wala. So there's this whole song around it. And then there's a poem that Durga Lal Shrestha wrote. But when he was illustrating, he was accessing his own childhood. But the way of living that exists here actually is also changing very rapidly in the way that urbanization is working. So this children's book became a way for Suman to just sort of put his own childhood into the picture book itself. And so the picture book is one option, but where else can we go, right? So the idea of nature and the natural world around us. So this is something that we've started working on more now, is how do you actually go outside the classroom? How do you actually learn from the natural world? How do you think of the non-human world as part of the ecosystems that we live in? And also the complexities around it, right? So again, in the classroom space, you have one space where people from lots of different castes and ethnicities are together. And sometimes it veers on being almost disrespectful, because we want to do these quick workshops, you know? That's the danger of the educational field, is you want to do these revolutionary kind of, oh, we want to open up spaces. But sometimes we don't take the time to get to know the stories and do it slower, you know, and needing to slow the pace down. And this was a workshop where we felt that we had pushed it too far. And I mean, I can talk about this more separately. But in general, how does it all come back together in terms of pedagogy and methodology? So as going back to the teaching space, so artists as teachers, teachers as experimenting with the arts, finding where is the magic, you know? What do you do in an actual teaching space? So some of the work that we're doing, I'm just giving you little glimpses, but here an artist actually facilitated a workshop based on a storybook, and also facilitated the workshops for the teachers to try it. And so the teachers would actually observe, and there was a video here, so you could have actually seen it. And over time, there was actually a video here as well, but basically the teachers also then bring that practice. So in this video, I'll just describe it. The teacher is not Tamang. She's from a higher caste, or a so-called higher caste. And the students are majority Tamang. In this village, that is majority Tamang. It's Gunsa in Sindhu Palchok. And she tried a lesson. So one of the biggest problems in Nepal is that the teachers are from different communities than the students themselves. So here, interestingly, through a method of actually using movement and dance, she was able to connect with her students, where she asked them to kind of plant. You know, what does planting look like when you guys are doing the planting? So she asked them, and then you would have seen in the video where she says, the students say they want to do tamse. And she goes, oh, you want to do tamse? So she's somebody who doesn't speak Tamang, but was open to actually using the language. As soon as she did that, the students immediately responded. So there's things that teachers can use, you know, and I think that's the kind of hope that we kind of want to work with when we talk about, you know, what's the role of artists, teachers, and students and children, and kind of taking a stance where, you know, it's a process of listening to each other. So if we don't know, if the teacher doesn't know, then who are they going to ask? If the student doesn't know, who are they going to ask? If the artist doesn't know, who are they going to ask? So it's taking this stance of being like, where are the stories? You know, how do we build that loom back together? How do we actually do the weaving process ourselves? That's kind of the end of the presentation. Sorry.
Mist that slopes in stealthily, cloaking and shrouding trees, vistas, the edges of things becoming blunt, soft, folding in to become opaque, invisible. The clothes that I washed almost a week ago haven't yet dried. I had left them hanging on the clothesline outside, in hopes of tempting out a weak sun from behind the clouds, while the mist soaked into them, infusing them with its own smells of moisture, scenting them with rain, odors of decay, of rot, excess, of overripeness, of humidity. The mist feels cool and damp. It brings forth ghosts like vapors. The ghosts remind us of deep time, carrying echoes of erasure, of removal and repressions, of evictions, uprootings, untimely deaths. Every landscape, as we now know, is haunted by past ways of life. I seek out conversation with ghosts to be reminded that we live in an impossible present, a time of rupture, of endings, of mortality. We are reminded that we are living in a world haunted by the threat of extinction, and again we choose to ignore that we inhabit a world already becoming extinct. For extinction is a multi-species event, occurring in stages and assemblages. Which is to say, it has already begun. This is a dirge. As the anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose writes, extinction is a double death. It extinguishes times yet to come. Back in the forest, I find myself contemplating life and decay. The life of a 500-year-old pine tree. The lives of rock formations that began over 50 million years ago. The life of a plastic packet of crisps, doomed to exist forever, to be dead, but to never dissolve. I make walks in these forests and I am propelled into future time. Bit by bit, the forest is withdrawing, one sense at a time. At times I smell trash instead of fir and pine. Other times I hear the highway, traffic jams, engines revving, instead of wind and birdsong. One day, not so far away, perhaps there will come a time when I will stop seeing the trees. By then, the forest will have fully withdrawn, fully disappeared, have been removed from time. Adrian Rich writes, I won't tell you where the place is, the dark mesh of the woods meeting the unmarked strip of light, ghost-ridden crossroads, leaf-mold paradise. I know already who wants to buy it, sell it, make it disappear. And I won't tell you where it is, so why do I tell you anything? Because you still listen. Because in times like these, to have you listen at all, it's necessary to talk about trees. Shifting landscapes. I think of olive trees. I think of Palestine. I think of life. I think of orange orchards in Gaza, wild akub and zatar in Galilee and Jerusalem. I know already who wants to buy it, sell it, make it disappear. I return to the forest with this question. How does one tell impossible stories? I can't seek out direct answers. Instead, I sense my way towards them. Nahi nigah mein manzil to justuju hi sahi, nahi visal muyassar to arzu hi sahi. This roughly translates to, if the destination is not visible, at least there is a quest. If a reunion with the beloved is not possible, then longing will have to suffice. I look outside of the archive. I ready myself for testimonies that are rendered immaterial because no one was there to receive them, to witness them, to record them into history. I let the outside in. I traverse time's other side. Your memory gets in the way of my history. How can we switch from ordinary to sacred time? I have been advised to do it recklessly, without signal. My history gets in the way of your memory. The debris of capitalist waste and the unspectacular afterlives of discarded things are stockpiled across mountainsides. Ghosts of extractive colonialism mingle with neon-tinged apparitions of capitalism in the old new world of hill stations turned into tourist towns with monoculture tea plantations, telecom networks, and luxury hotels. How do colonial relations between people and land persist despite political independence? What can we do to co-produce decolonial alternatives? What can relationships of love and care look like in this fragile ecosystem on the precipice of collapse? How to love a tree. Two characters are conversing with each other across time and space. The first, Sajid, a local forest guide in Natya Gali, and the second, John, the ghost of an imperial botanist who was residing inside a tree for over 200 years until the tree is slowly killed off. Why was the tree killed, you might ask? Colonial forestry law assumed ownership and possession of forests and trees. This was done with a mind to commercially exploit forests to extract timber for railways, for building ships, and to clear land for plantations. After decolonization, forest-related laws continue to operate with the same principle: ownership and control. During the 1990s in Pakistan, after severe flooding, all commercial activity in the forest was halted. Local villagers protested as they needed firewood to warm their homes and to cook food. A clause was introduced. The villagers could log any dead, dry, or diseased tree for firewood. This logic opened up a loophole. Locals began to strip off tree bark with their axes, drying out and killing trees. Sometimes they would burn parts of the tree trunk to hide the axe marks. First colonialism and then coloniality have impoverished this entire landscape. Last year, I invited 4 musicians to play a concert to 4 different dying trees as a gesture of love and care. The forest constitutes a vast archaeological archive, and all the beings that live within and around are speaking to us. Somehow, we have forgotten their language. We have lost it from our tongues and cannot seem to understand or make legible what is being clearly expressed. This is one of the tasks set upon the forest guard and the botanist, to try to recover a language to read the signs, to communicate and dialogue once more among species, to gather a witnessing of history from more than human perspectives. After realizing that he is now seeing John everywhere that he goes and wherever his gaze lands, Sajid asks John, "How do you appear everywhere that I go?" John: "I had spent a lot of time in these forests. One day, after months of sickness, instead of dying, my spirit went into a tree. Yes, the same one that you were examining last week. I became part of that tree and began living inside it." Sajid: "Why did you reveal yourself to me?" John, because you wanted to know how to love a tree. You didn't ask, but you wanted to know all the same. Thank you. One more thing. I made some screen prints as part of this work, as part of this project, How to Love a Tree. The screen prints were made for a fundraiser for Gaza. I have a few of them here with me. I'm selling each print for 20 euros. And so please hit me up, look for me, yeah, after.
How's everyone feeling? Tired, exhausted? I am, but in a good way because of all the amazing thinkers. Thank you so much, Keng Sen, Fariba, entire Prince Claus team for your organization. Fernando, I'm sure, I don't know if you've slept the last couple of days, but it's just amazing to be here. Because I know it's been a long day and we've been just receiving so much information, maybe we can all just take a deep breath. I think I need it. Just ground ourselves in this space. I want to begin by acknowledging the fact that at the moment in my life, I'm based in Australia, which has been the historical space of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who have been stewards of the place for 60,000 years. And I want to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and future, but also elders, indigenous elders, and communities everywhere in the world. And I recognize that settler colonialism is not an event, but it is a structure. And as we see this, and it's horrific, with Palestine, at the moment we see active indigenous erasure happening in the world. As Shahidul started us by saying 1,200 people were just killed yesterday, and just because of the ways we move through the world, with all the entangled complicities of capital and colonization, we are witnessing it, but somehow not able to stop it. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that. In the same way, today in my presentation, in a linear way, and by acknowledging imperfectness, solidarity, and the fact that we fail a lot, I identified through a spiral a series of interrelated projects built out of long-term relationships, friendships, and networks that weave together what I situate myself, which is the context of Karachi, and the relationship that it has to the elsewheres, and this is not a binary, as you will see, but for the purposes of today, the elsewheres is the part of the region that I identify as South Asia that does not lie in the current border geography of Pakistan, and the diasporas that are formed from this region in other lands. In the presentation, you will see the emergence of continued protagonists as well. I will name people that you'll recognize actually, and I hope that this all kind of at some point makes sense, the networks. An ode to how art worlds, life worlds, cultural worlds are built through long relationships that ebb and flow depending on context and politics. And sometimes relationships last lifetimes and sometimes they rupture. I know people talk about grand gestures, but in my work, I'm interested in the minor key, as Saidiya Hartman reminds us, in the ways of unfolding that happen together in daily life, in conversations, under cover, projects that are not documented, under opacity, the dialogues that happen online, and also the unseen labor of people that make this happen, including this event, of course. I also just want to press on the word kin. The idea for me of making kinship, of friendship, of dosti, of yari is a form of connecting that transcends much separation, but also is a politics of being otherwise. Here, this is again not to romanticize, but also to acknowledge the imperfect capacities of kinship. What do I do? Okay. Karachi. I begin to ground myself in Karachi, that city by the Arabian Sea that for many years, and apparently in the list of the world, is one of the most unlivable cities with its deep ethnic and sectarian ruptures. But that's my home and where I have many family and friends. In 2014, a group of artists, writers, filmmakers, some recently returned, some based for a while, started gathering to think about what possibilities of art practice could exist in this neoliberal space where a lot of the art was privatized and in galleries and inaccessible. Fazl Rizvi, the first protagonist, who will come back in different ways, initiated this gathering, and through him, we started meeting in the points that I've marked in different parts of the city. And this was the first foray of community and gathering before we had the language, the theory, all the big ways in which we talk about some things that allowed me to ground myself into this nucleus of makers that I name again, Shahana Rajani, Zara Malkani, Umar Wasim, Hajra Heather, and so many others who are now continuing to work within Karachi and transnational contexts. Elsewheres. So what is separations geography? Everything is just that mystery. Everything in this roar is this roar that deafens. The stream has branched off from the Indus in Little Tibet just to find itself for porous miles down. There it will join the Jhelum, lost to the Greeks. It will become in Pakistan the Indus again. As the Kashmiri American poet Agha Shahid Ali writes, this is what is separations geography. And of course, this is sort of me going a bit off the cuff, but I was delighted to see that kind of touched upon the kind of haunting of partition and nationalism that moves through South Asia, and I think is something that we're not able to grapple with. So the first time that I went to India, I circled it because there are no direct flights between India and Pakistan, but also Pakistan and Nepal and Pakistan and Bangladesh. So I moved through borders and waters, moving through time and space. And of course, it's almost impossible to get to India, but this queen was like very much insistent on getting there. And there was a lot of people's labor which was involved. Actually, all three of them are sitting in the audience, Stefan Winkler, Pooja Sood, and Marvi Mazhar. So a lot of hustling happened, a lot of calling of ambassadors. And in 2018, I got this unicorn visa to go to Khoj in New Delhi for curated intensive South Asia. We can talk about why is the curated intensive South Asia happening in a place that Pakistanis can't normally go, but that's a question for another time. And as you can see, police reporting visa, single, 20 days. And we didn't even mention Khoj. It's because I was doing a Goethe program. And of course, I turned on my Grindr. It was fun to sort of, be fetishized and get all these things. And one of the first messages was like, what are you doing in India and why you guys hate India? That is its own symposium that I don't think we have a time to kind of go into at the moment. But there's all of us in that coach, young people at that time. But Sharari was in it, so it's incredible to see that she's here, and Nayantara and many other incredible people who are again going to be protagonists in this story of Elsewhere that I'm going to now continue with. If then there was a potential to circle through, then what borders can we break? What communities and kinship can we imagine? What can these connections look like? How can we imagine ways of being otherwise? In Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie imagines this moment of midnight, of magic, and otherwise world-making because of the border that then appears and those who are born in that weird liminal moment. So I imagine it is also in this dark night, under the midnight, in the club space, in all these spaces that we have, and under this moon, that the border can be undone. And the border here, I mean on multiple levels. And again, I don't mean to romanticize it, but again, find this as a complex space of possibility and rupture. Following from these moments and encounters and grounding, in 2019, I organized the exhibition, Is It Possible to Live Outside of Language? The line of this exhibition takes from the book Ministry of Utmost Happiness that Arundhati Roy had just published, where one of the central protagonists is Anjum, who is born intersex in Delhi. When her mother realizes the child is intersex, she wonders about the Urdu language, which is gendered, and she thinks about how do you describe, right? Like, again, in a language which is gendered, people who fall outside of the nexus of this language. So what happens when language fails us? This is one of the 3 queer-related exhibitionary and long-term unfolding projects intertwined and linked together that I've been involved with that happen at the Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture in Karachi. While there are positive aspects of it, but one does not really sort of, just when I say the academy is useless, it's not a side of necessarily queer making, I know, of unfolding or enabling, but it is this place where we have been able to do the work. I personally find that the work can happen as theorized by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney in the Undercommons, in the hidden underbelly. They talk about stealing, and I'm thinking a lot of us are obviously stealing in different ways and yet complicit in some of these institutions. I also just want to acknowledge here that this exhibition and this sort of a moment that I'm showing you happened because I'd met the artist collective, the Many-Headed Hydra, in Colombo Scope in January 2019. And the print is the work of Vicky Shah Jahan, an artist based in Slave Island here in Colombo. Some of you may have seen her mural, incredible mural. And her poetic work, for me, unfolds as a gesture of breaking borders. This is her at the ocean here in Colombo, sort of doing this performative gesture, which is then imprinted on a wall that actually faces the Arabian Sea in Karachi. Within the project, a 3-day alternative curriculum titled the Emerging Practitioners Program was initiated that offered a alternative curriculum of queer readings and gatherings, a way of bringing students together from different universities in Pakistan who had not found those safe spaces. What, again, are these spaces that we can imagine outside of the biopolitical regime of the university, and what alliances can we create? Within this program, at the end, in the feedback session with the participants, we discussed the need for further infrastructure of making, but how to do so in a place where being queer comes with immense risk, with illegality, with ways of existing in the liminal space of shadow and visibility. Elsewheres, so we're not going straight, we're kind of, because queer time, we're just moving in interesting circles and spirals. Following the meeting at Khoj with Sumitra Sundar from Bangalore and myself from Karachi, both interested in the notion of the queer archive, we started thinking about what archives are, where possibilities for us to exist and come together can be. But what happens when the archive of your people is denied to you because of these bordered ruptures? But what happens in that way, and how can queerness and transness offer us a possibility to mobilize in these places? For me here, trans is also a way of literally transcending, right? Literally moving across borders, time, and space. And again, as was pointed out, I think, again, we can really imagine Kathmandu as a site where some of this alternative imaginary can exist and decenter, I think, and not really think about Delhi, Bombay, Karachi, and Islamabad, which are quite, in their own way, fascist and problematic sites, but remember and honor otherwise ways of being together and allow other epistemologies to emerge. Following on from the project, Is It Possible to Live Outside of Language? So now we're back to Karachi. On a plane going back into diasporas, the Many-Headed Hydra and I dreamt of what would become the project, a language where yesterday and tomorrow are the same word, kal. Again, we were inspired by the poem of another queer Kashmiri American writer, Fatima Asghar, who takes the jumping off point of kal, and we imagine kal as a queer word, a word that cannot be fully grasped. This word that in Urdu, Hindi, and other South Asian languages means both yesterday and tomorrow. It moves across space and time. It catches you and, again, fills you in language. Thinking through intertwined futures, the relationship of yesterdays and tomorrows, from 2020 to 2023, kal worked as an alternate infrastructure, moving through pandemic, economic, political crisis in Colombo and Karachi, climate disaster, illness, sickness, and to make possible community in these times in slower, quieter, and underground ways. Kal unfolded as a series of workshops, radio, gatherings that we call the House of Kal in Karachi, Colombo, and Berlin. And these were spaces of co-making, co-dreaming, and co-being. And it is where residents of Karachi and Colombo, through Open Call, we had these artists in residence who were able to make their own space on their own terms. And again, to undo the model of visibility, there wasn't an idea of an exhibition, but an idea of an open house, of co-making something together that happened at the end of that. This was, for us, a space of anti-racist, anti-fascist, queer, and feminist possibility. And again, to name protagonists, Sandev Handi, who's actually, I think, giving the presentation after me, was the co-curator of House of Kal Colombo with Sakina Ali Akbar, Fiza Khatri and Zahabia Khuzaima were the co-curators in Karachi, and with Suza Hussein of the Many-Headed Hydra, I was working on the Berlin and also the Karachi section. Within Kal, one of the artists, Sophia Lela Afsar, another protagonist, who had actually been trained as a lawyer and a therapist, and so this was her first foray in art practice, focused on ideas of play, disability, neurodivergence, and of course, very importantly for her, transgender remembrance, recognition, despair, and joy. As one of her contributions to the House of Kal in Karachi, Lela worked with the trans community to identify and recognize the names of, at that time, 11 trans folks who had been killed in Pakistan until in that year, so until August 2021. And this was beset and against a surge of trans violence in the country where trans communities have legal rights through the trans gender law. By the end of 2021, that number had exceeded 20. And so the kind of the purple kind of names that you see is, and that's Sophia Lela standing with a mask and kind of doing this offering as part of the House of Kal. She also invited members of the trans community to make armbands, again, naming and commemorating all these women who had been killed. And every visitor to the house was invited to wear this armband as a form of, sort of just recognition, but also about mourning. I also just want to here touch base on class and kind of recognize who's allowed into these spaces. Again, we're at Indus Valley, right? How are these spaces accessible because of security and biopolitical regimes? And what happens when those boundaries are blurred? What possibilities are made possible, and what discomfort arises for those gatekeepers, and how we can keep on pushing at that discomfort. In this surprising way, in which the art world can hopefully sometimes seep into actual life and go beyond the gatekeep, but not hopefully in a way that is manufactured and something that is wayward. 2 months later, there was an almost fatal attack on trans activist and thinker in Pakistan, Mehrab Moiz Awan, which led to a spontaneous and last-minute demonstration of trans visibility, a gathering of mourning, but also of joy, power, and presence. This powerful moment brought light the capacity to organize in public space and to demand a better future to be there. Lela's work that was in the House of Kal, she was part of the protest and was distributed into this public process. And so the work moved through its own, transcending beyond walls into space where it was recontextualized and became a space of not just memory, but also of power. Since this moment, and against a continued assault on trans rights in Pakistan, driven by middle-class respectability politics and the continued need for the state to find scapegoats for its own failures with a heavy military presence and delayed elections and economic crisis and ecological crisis, of course, the state needs to find ways to, put the blame on people that actually don't have anything to do with its own failures. There has been an extreme rise in trans violence, but of course also very powerful organizing, which led to the first Sindh Murat March about a year ago, and the second one just happened. And again, it was incredible to see the ways in which there was these trans mobilizations and solidarities that started happening that moved, again, from these different worlds of organizing, of culture, and then went into activism and public space. So in that way, I also ask, where can the curatorial lie beyond these kind of theories and in these kind of writings that we do and actually make kinship possible where it matters and where actually we need to organize and mobilize with each other. Sophia Lela has continued to be a protagonist in my work. We're working on a new ongoing project called Belonging Disbelonging, again at the Indus Valley School of Architecture. We've literally made that space queer, but they don't even know that we've done it. I love it. And in this month, she's been initiating a 3-month process of being a resident in the gallery there, bringing together the art community, all the students in, to kind of interact with her and fill the walls of the gallery with kind of their thoughts and their feelings. And of course, a lot has come up in this time. One of the slides that, one of the kind of graffiti, which was early on, is called Paisa Paint, Tamasha Dekh, which means throw some money and look at the performance. So you're welcome. We're doing that. But I also, of course, want to kind of here honor the ways in which, trans communities are made to feel like they can only exist and be legible when they perform according to the roles of society, which means kind of be dancers or sex workers, and what happens when they demand other places and kind of, interact with kind of power and community and legal recognition. Just continuing with one of the final results of what happened with Lela. As I circle back, I'm kind of coming to the elsewheres, which is at the moment here, so Colombo, and I want to honor 2 moments that are grounded here and connect my Karachi with all these multiple elsewheres. So one of the houses of Kal was in Colombo and Karachi, but of course it also happened in Berlin, and we just finished the Berlin one. And the fabulous Venuri Pereira has also been a co-maker of Kal for us since the very beginning. And in Berlin, just like 2 months ago, she opened the House of Kal Berlin with the passport blessing ceremony, a powerful performance, which I actually personally still feel in my bones. And she was referring to her own Sri Lankan passport. And of course, I'm sure many of us here have passports passports that we can call, I can say it because I have a Pakistani passport, the shit passports of the world, you know? We need a visa to go everywhere. And she divided the room into powerful and non-powerful passports. And just to take from Minuri, if you don't know if your passport is powerful or not powerful, it is powerful. That's what she told us all. So she had this antagonist-protagonist moment, and she being the protagonist and the antagonist being a cis white man, through which she created a series of interactions undoing the dehumanizing visa process we go through with the Global South passport to go through places like Europe, and the blessings of whiteness that we need to actually move through. If you remember, my Indian visa actually came because of the German ambassador and the Goethe Institute. So I was fully blessed by Germans to get to India. But this makes us behave, perform, and supplicate in ways that make us more complicit and adjacent to whiteness. And so what happens in this time when those ideas for us fall apart? And I know Keng Sen actually commissioned this performance at first in 2015, which I didn't know. So I think there's an incredible circularity happening here as well. I end here again with the work of Vicky Shahjahan, who made this also beautiful mural in Berlin, again, as part of House of Kal, where she brought together narratives of the communities that she's working with in Slave Island in Sri Lanka and Colombo. That is actually a portrait of a grandmother. And she kind of had this closed workshop with feminist, queer, migrant, intergenerational individuals in Berlin, thinking about the relationships of crossing, of eviction, of displacement, of housing, and of erasure. And taking the work that came out of this workshop and the beautiful work that Vicky made, who's located here, I want to remember that we belong to this land and this land belongs to us. And that this is a moment for us to recognize, as Puerto Rican feminist writer Aurora Levins Morales writes, we cannot cross until we carry each other. So from the Karachi coast to the mountains in the Himalayas to this coast, I dream and manifest that we can gather and form entanglements across this otherwise bordered, ruptured, separated geography, which has been our inheritance. I refuse this inheritance of our separation, and instead, in these extreme narrow nationalisms in our homelands, find shimmers of our crossing into otherwise futures of togetherness. Thank you.
Thank you, Aziz. Thank you, Keng Sen, and thank you everyone who's presented today. I'm coming to you today to speak occupying two places. That is as a curator, as an institution, as part of an institution, which is the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Sri Lanka. And perhaps the exact inverse, which is a place, a collective, a group of people that function almost as the exact antithesis of an institution, and that is part of a loose collective of artists titled a packet. In speaking today about some legacies of solidarity, I'm hoping to share a series of vignettes that look at failures and raise questions that perhaps I myself am unable to answer. To begin, I want to zoom on an exhibition at the MMCA, but closely look at some of the research around it. If you look at the poem over there, you might even recognize some of the names that are listed there. The poem goes, Lumumba's silence beneath the grave, Nasser's courage that built the Aswan Dam, Mandela's tears, Kenyatta's voice, Mao's sweat, Sirimavo's struggle, Uncle Ho's determination, and Bankarno's efforts. All that is significant, it ends, as the color of blood is. In the decades following World War II, and amid the intensifying Cold War, a wave of sentiment swept across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Communities long subjected to colonial exploitation sought a new global order between Western dominance and its moral bankruptcy, or what it saw as its moral bankruptcy. Much like where we all are today, sitting here, struggling to stop it or confront it. This collective yearning led to the formation of what you might all know now as the Non-Aligned Movement in 1961, symbolizing a desire for self-determination and solidarity among newly independent nations. The movement was not just a political stance, but an emotional response to years of marginalization, where many formerly colonized nations and some in the midst of ongoing anti-colonial struggles were for the first time reckoning with what it meant to write their own stories and be authors of their own narrative. This era, characterized by its cultural interactions and intellectual exchanges, represented a critical reimagining of national identities and international solidarities, free from the constraints of colonial legacies. Poems like those by Aryavansa Pathir, published in the Afro-Asian Poetry 1966, a little booklet, encapsulated this new international imagination. In 2020, while preparing for an exhibition at the museum, Shamini Pereira and I discovered a damaged painting by Senaka Senanayaka in a hotel staff area. We found out that this work was actually nearly 50 years old and was originally commissioned for the 1976 Non-Aligned Summit held in Colombo, where it adorned the hotel lobby, in which, visible to a lot of many of the delegates who were staying at the conference or coming for the conference. This included the likes of Nehru, Nasser, Tito, Gaddafi. Senanayaka's painting, showcasing Sri Lanka's essence with radiating discs of color, attempted to symbolize, this sort of scene of a country, symbolizing unity amongst diverse nations, and was strategically placed right in front of the ballroom where the delegates would meet, placed so that they will be able to see it and experience it, sort of summarizing or summating the attitude of the non-alignment movement. Discovering Senanayaka's painting led us to explore the ways in which Sri Lanka played a significant role in shaping international third worldist solidarities. Our exhibition delved into the nation's influence on modernism, national identity, and the formation of international allegiances during the Cold War. But the next work we came across was from another conference, actually, that predated the 76 conference, almost 22 years before. And that is, this work by Aubrey Collette. Here in 1955, Aubrey Collette, a member of the 43 group, political cartoonist, created a work depicting the Bandung Conference. The piece highlighted key figures like Sri Lankan Minister Kotalavala, Egyptian Minister Nasser, Indian Prime Minister Nehru, and also underscored sort of China's emerging influence on the decolonization discourse. The Bandung Summit was a curious moment. Like I said, it was a moment in which many of these nations were coming together, attempting to craft and imagine a sort of new third worldist imagination. What the Bandung moment essentially led to is the creation of the non-aligned movement, and the 5th Non-Aligned Summit was held in Sri Lanka. This was a key moment for Sri Lanka because it sort of catapulted Sri Lanka's role in the movement, whereas before it had played a much smaller role. And Sirimavo Bandaranayake, the Prime Minister at the time, was also sort of took center stage. If the non-aligned movement was looking at sort of international diplomacy as its means of kind of crafting this new third worldism, there was a parallel movement to non-alignment, and that was the movement of the Afro-Asian writers. Also, kind of tracing its history to Bandung, they performed in 1958 in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, emphasizing the role of culture and especially literature in emancipation. This group of African and Asian writers focused on using literary expression to build solidarity amongst once colonized nations. A key achievement of the Afro-Asian writers is a magazine that many of you might actually be quite famous or quite familiar with, which is that of Lotus magazine, a trilingual quarterly journal featuring contributors like Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Alex Laguma, Yusuf El Sabah, the Egyptian foreign minister, and at one point head of the PLO. Often seen as a beacon of radical modernism for the third world, Lotus is actually commonly associated with its beginnings in South Asia. It began somewhere in South Asia. Sometimes even people would refer to it as having begun somewhere in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Our research, however, revealed a more intricate narrative, marked by ideological rifts and exiles, challenging the simplistic understanding of its inception, and highlighting the complexities in forming a platform for third world socialist solidarity. Contrary to popular belief, Lotus did not begin in South Asia. In my research, I discovered that the Afro-Asian writers movement, however, did. It began in South Asia, not in India, but in Ceylon at the time, in Colombo, but more specifically, in 1958, in Colombo 8, down Castle Street, at that office that you see right up there. It belonged to its first General Secretary, R.D. Senanayake, who was pivotal in establishing the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau, a key component of this movement in challenging the common belief that the movement started outside of South Asia. The Colombo-based Afro-Asian Writers Bureau, established in 1958, featured contributions from China, Ceylon, India, and beyond. And emblematic of this movement, Ratna Deshapriya Senanayake, a former Sri Lankan MP and ambassador to China, powerfully captured its essence. In every single one of the publications, he would declare, "Long live the militant friendship of the Afro-Asian writers. Long live the solidarity of the Afro-Asian peoples." This quote reflects the deep-rooted camaraderie and shared vision against colonialism that united writers across this region. The Afro-Asian Poems anthology encompassed a diverse range of voices, featuring writings not only from Ceylon, but also from the Soviet Union, China, Congo, and India, and beyond, showcasing the breadth of international movements. In the late 1960s, however, the Colombo Bureau of the Afro-Asian Writers was faced with sort of a rift. China, amid its cultural revolution, viewed the Soviet Union as a Western power, and the Soviets were involved in the Afro-Asian Writers movement as a Western power opposing its anti-imperial stance. This led the Colombo Bureau, which is based in Colombo, to align with China, sidelining Soviet sympathizers. The division then gave rise to two parallel publications, one less popular, and the other that you might all be more familiar with, which is Lotus. In 1968, the Colombo Bureau, under the Chinese influence, launched The Call, while the Soviet Red Bureau initiated Afro-Asian Writings, which was later called Lotus. What was curious about this particular moment was this split shifted the heart of third worldist thought, or at least the third worldist thought that was being published. And it moved it towards Lotus, recentering it away from South Asia. If you look over here, I'm looking at two of the similar refrains from the two riffs on the two sides of the magazine, and the various sort of slight tweaks in some of the references to the militant friendship that they are making. In 1966, this split, known as the Sino-Soviet split, led Mao Zedong to summon Sri Lankan editor R.D. Senanayake and his wife to Beijing for a two-week visit. Senanayake's trip extended into a 2-year stay where he started publishing a magazine titled The Call. The Call was published in the bureau in Colombo under Chinese editorial direction, and it featured content on China's role in third world politics. What's curious about this particular magazine is it covered notably, it depicted combatants, symbolizing the necessary struggle, that armed struggle was necessary against imperialism in regions like Vietnam, Angola, and Palestine. As we started going about doing this research, and then upon further research, what one sort of discovers, however, is every time the Sri Lankan delegation, that is the local Sri Lankan delegation who was in charge or working with the Afro-Asian writers, in their attempt to speak to deliver statements and theses on the plight of countries, they actually did something else. They conveniently sidestepped the need to embody their own politics in their own home countries. While many contributors from Sri Lanka would travel to a ton of conferences and deliver scathing rebukes to the Western world on the topics of Palestine and Vietnam, they conveniently avoided acknowledging the violence perpetuated in their own countries. I came across this by just looking quite simply comparatively at these magazines and some of the grassroots publishing that's happening simultaneously. And you have the grassroots publishing addressing so many of the things, some of the issues that are permeating in the local context. Whereas you have the political elite with influence who are essentially traveling elsewhere, representing Sri Lanka, kind of jumping on to this call of non-alignment and third worldism and Afro-Asian solidarity, but conveniently not ever mentioning or addressing some of the local kind of tensions that are going on. The third world is socialist internationalism espoused here was a selective one that could only exist in an imagined place. As Sarah Ahmed reflects, solidarity does not assume that our struggles are the same struggles, or that our pain is the same pain, or that our hope is for the same future. Solidarity involves commitment and work, as well as the recognition that even if we do not have the same feelings, or the same lives, or the same bodies, we live on common ground. To be in solidarity then is to fundamentally understand that from what ground that solidarity is emerging from. In this case, when that ground is understood and augmented through conceptions of the nation, the fractures in the Afro-Asian movement shows us that those solidarities are perhaps destined for a kind of failure. It is failures of these publishing movements that in turn draw further mediations on place. To talk about solidarity then is to talk about placemaking. What you are seeing here is a page spread from the second anthology that I want to draw out a bit more. The first page, on page 6, is titled Awake Sinhala Youth. And it adopts a kind of post-colonial melancholy and an attempt at rallying a new relationship to place and country. It says, now as foreigners in their own land, even in dreams they talk in English, and are proud looking down on their own Sinhala people. Here is a post-colonial call to action. That when we read now on the other side of what has been Sri Lanka's violent history of ethno-nationalist Sinhala Buddhist supremacy, reads as a very, very scary premonition. A decolonial approach, far preceding what we now come to understand as the decolonial. It squarely placed an identity, or more squarely a reductive identifier, as a means of making a place and finding kinship in that place. Awake Sinhala youth. The poem on the next page, however, by C.V. Velupillai, titled Tea Pluckers, provides a different vignette. On one of Sri Lanka's most marginalized and oppressed populations, even to this day, is that of the upcountry Tamil indentured laborers who work on plantations, whom until quite recently were not even recognized as citizens. Here, another attempted placemaking is being contested. 8 hours in a day, 7 times in a week, thus their lifeblood flows to fashion this land a paradise for some. The poem retracts the conception of Sri Lanka as a tropical paradise that allowed it to thrive as a tourist destination and continues to, and captured it as an exotic land in the Western and the local imaginary, and attempts to unearth what that moniker actually erases. Page 6 and page 7. I think if anything can help us make sense of place, or rather, the impossibility of making sense of a place, it is precisely this editorial choice. This page spread, page 6 and page 7, sitting in contradiction. Another failure I want to reflect on was part of an exhibition that was put together by Shamini Pereira, and was one of the first exhibitions at the museum. It was another work made in the same decade, and it's a work by W.J.G. Beeling of the now famous 43 group of modernists. In view from Layard's Road house window, Beeling paints what many visitors to the exhibition remarked as, I'm not sure, the outdoors? What Beeling is actually painting here is not just a window, or a tree, or a wall, or a road, or a bush, but rather the thing that all of these supposed subject matter negates or obscures, and that is of his friend's house. The house in question is where Aubrey Collette, a founding member of the 43 group, lived. When Beeling painted this work, however, Collette was no longer living in the house he depicts. In 1961, Collette was forced into exile and left Sri Lanka, never to return, due to the political nature of his cartoons and in the conjunction with the mass exodus of many of the others from the Burgher community. who felt there was no place in a post-colonial hegemony Sri Lanka was crafting for itself. In spite of Beating's portrayal of Colette's former home in bright day's sun, his painting is as much a portrait of loss in the face of a dark political machinations at work in the country at the time. To attempt to construct a cosmology of solidarity then is to imagine this solidarity as a place, and that solidarity that is augmented by its gaps. And in that to make sense of exile. That is to be sensitive to the ways in which the efficacy of solidarity is constituted by the very people who have been forced outside of its potentialities. All of this is happening parallel to the non-aligned movement and the Afro-Asian writings, where all of these delegates from Sri Lanka are, making these sort of large diatribes everywhere in the world against decolonization, against, this new third worldist possibilities. The final one I want to show you is about this character in this photo all the way at the end here. On the right, you'll see it's R.D. Senanayake, the head of the General Secretary of the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau in Colombo. But on the left is someone in research where when we were talking to the estate was simply referred to as, there wasn't that Indonesian fellow. And in researching that Indonesian fellow further, what we were able to find and come across is that Indonesian person, his name was Hersri Saituan. Hersri was part of the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau, was working together with R.D. Senanayake and many of the other writers, living in R.D. Senanayake's house, in that office that you see up here. In 1965, when the Suharto regime essentially took over Indonesia, diplomatic relationships with Sri Lanka shifted. It forced Hersri to leave Colombo, Castle Street, Colombo 8, and go back to Indonesia. On his way back, he's intercepted by the military and placed in the Buru torture camp for 20 years. Eventually, we were able to get in touch with him, meet him. I actually was presenting on some of this research when someone came up on stage and started taking photos of a lot of the publications. And later I realized I was meeting Hersri's wife, who was saying he never knew that this work was being looked at or remembered for that matter. And the reason I want to talk about Hersri is also someone who is living here was now forgotten, never remembered by the very people who were chairing and running and spearheading this movement in Sri Lanka in particular. When we're talking about solidarities that fail when they become augmented by the nation state, I think Hersri's story in particular is one of them. To move forward, as perhaps the last response, I want to talk about the antithesis, perhaps, of the institution, which is the artist collective that I'm a part of, which is called The Packet. It has a particular focus on hyperlocality, collaborative processes, and conversation, and grew out of 8 artists coming together to realize an artist publication titled The Packet. While a core group of members continue to drive its work, the Packet functions as sort of a collaborative platform that has embraced the work of 19 to 20 young artists in Sri Lanka to date. The work crosses print, digital mediums, and with site-specific interventions that respond to a stratified world, exploring what it looks like to do thinking in public. The question is, what is this stratified world that we're responding to? And one of the ways in which what we were responding to at the time was the way in which perhaps artists from Sri Lanka, from similar parts of the world, were sort of asked to continually bare your soul, to talk about, to represent all of the concerns that were animating your local context all the time. And to ask for whom is it being represented, and for whom is it being spoken. To bare your souls out and speak at things in a way a global cultural audience might be able to respond to. The Packet decided to markedly refuse this approach and instead situate its practice from a place of speaking from and not to or at, to center intimacy, playfulness, and irreverence. If artists from elsewhere can play and joke and deliver transcendental meditations on everyday life, why is it that we have a political task ahead of us and a higher task asked of us? Why can't we produce a kind of different kind of locality. There's, David Graeber talks about this idea of interpretive labor in a broad sense, which is when those in power never have to take on the work of interpreting the life and understanding the lives of those below. But those below have to often take up the task of understanding the person in power much more than they ever need to be, and completely, in order to be able to speak to them and speak at them, and not simply, as David Graeber puts it, so that they don't get hit over the head with a stick. This interpretive labor and this question of reversing this interpretive labor is where we began asking ourselves, why can't we produce a kind of locality or a hyper-locality rather than being expected to speak and speak at things, bearing our stories, and participating in a compounded performative kind of telling of who we are? What does working in a collective afford us further to do? By insisting on play and irreverence and intimacy, it inverts the ask on whom exactly needs to perform interpretive labor, and thereby undo the very power structures that is a victim of. While this was really exciting to look at play, look at irreverence, look at eating together and community and all of these sort of zeitgeisty terms that we like to talk about, one of the questions I perhaps am left with is this enough? Is these notions of pay, is this insistence, is this stubbornness on not performing interpretive labor but locating yourself in a sort of strict hyper-locality enough? Much like the milieu of intentional veiling and obfuscation that we see in the arts and cultural institutions around us, how do we reckon with the direct, ever-present violence around us? This ever-present violence that confronts us. Is hazy theorizing in the arts, in and of itself, a kind of political violence, similar to that of conceptions of the nation, placing us close enough that we can nod to urgent concerns, but stand far away enough that our work never has to be specific enough? Art institutions, I leave you with perhaps a little bit of quote in all of these questions, and I hope they're all maybe making sense to you. Which is, again, to quote Graeber, who talks about violence, and he says, "We are not used to thinking of nursing homes or banks or even HMOs as violent institutions." I would add art institutions or arts and cultural discourse to this list as well, except perhaps in the most abstract and metaphorical sense. But the violence I'm referring to here is not abstract. I'm not speaking of conceptual violence, I'm speaking of violence that, in a literal sense, the kind that involves, say, one person hitting another over the head with a wooden stick. All of these institutions involved in the allocation of resources within a system of property rights, regulated and guaranteed by governments in a system that ultimately rests on the threat of force. Force, in turn, is just a euphemistic way to refer to violence. That is, the ability to call up people dressed in uniforms, willing to threaten to hit others over the head with wooden sticks. He continues, and I'll leave you with this. It is curious how rarely citizens in industrial democracies actually think about this fact, or how instinctively we try to discount its importance. This is what makes it possible, for example, for graduate students, theorists, artists, art workers, to be able to spend days in the stacks of university libraries poring over Foucault-inspired theoretical tracts about the declining importance of coercion as a factor of modern life, without ever reflecting on the fact that had they insisted on their right to enter the stacks without showing a properly stamped and validated ID, armed men would have been summoned to physically remove them using whatever force might be required. I'm only bringing this in here because I talked about the nation, but I'm also talking about perhaps the obfuscation that comes with working in the arts, where perhaps our specificity, our lack of specificity is also, in many ways, our complicity. And I'll leave you with one last little note from the packet, which is this right here. Don't theorize, just realize. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being so patient today. Today I'm primarily sharing about the kinship, friendship, relationship I've built throughout the years and the venting sessions we primarily had through our artworks and artistic practices, and sometimes how spaces, art spaces like Kathmandu Triennale and Jogja Biennale that I've co-curated also becomes the spaces of trauma dumping. I'm also showing images, some of the images of artworks of our indigenous comrades from the collective I'm also part of, Art in Nepal, and some of the research initiative from Colombo that, again, I co-founded, and some of the fragments of preliminary concept of upcoming Colombo scope. Oh, it just jumped, okay. Dear Makasi, how can we cultivate sensorial resistance to a society that compels us to dissociate? Some days after our protest in front of the Embassy of Israel in Nepal, I came across a post on Instagram that stated, "Anger is a luxury that we cannot afford." An excerpt taken from the poem, "This is Why We Dance," by Palestinian writer Muhammad Al-Kurd in 2021. Your resilience came into my mind when I read this. As an indigenous woman, you have faced and endured violence perpetrated by the state against you and your community. During the armed resistance in Nepal, 1996-2006, which is the official date, Dalit, indigenous, and marginalized communities fought against the government, casteism, and the elites. In response, thousands lost their lives. Many were forcefully disappeared, injured, and tortured. This district of Bardia in western Nepal, with the majority of indigenous Tharu population, bore one of the heaviest human losses during this period. Recently, our friend, Lavkan Chaudhary, a Tharu himself, was invited to create a memorial in Bardia by the community for the disappeared people. While walking near the forest, he came across a site where Sita Chaudhary was raped by multiple army officers, Royal Nepal Army back then. She has not been found till this date. Later, at around 2 a.m. in the morning, that same day, that same night, Lavkan had the dream in which Sita Chaudhary sat next to him, face to face. When he woke up, the fan he had shut off was still on. It was somewhere between reality, dream, vision, something. Similar other incidents followed. When he shared this with some villagers, many people seemed to have similar experiences with the spirits. However, when Lavkan shared this experience of his with an activist friend, the friend laughed on his face. Invalidating trauma is a form of asserting power. Is there anything like actual solidarity, or is it a fleeting movement? Is solidarity just a fleeting movement? Traumas can persist beyond the immediate time frame of traumatic event, creating a ripple effect that transcends the individual who directly experienced it, impacting subsequent generations, relationships, and communities. How do we acknowledge the pain of our ancestors who've gone through those traumas? But also, how do we embrace the knowledge they have passed down to us? Ellen Foning, who is from the Eastern Himalayan region, shared how she went through a psychosis breakdown, also known as shaman's fever, only after when she went through that breakdown, she realized that she was from the lineage of woman shaman, also known as Mun. Her Lepcha community from Mount Kanchenjunga, which is also kind of like through the colonial lens seen as the third highest mountain in the world, holds deep spiritual significance as the locus of the origin story. The Tista River is fed by Kanchenjunga snowmelt and is also home to Ongo Sander, water dragon, whose visions Alien has.
who carries, the water dragon carries and represents the memories, stories, and intimate relationship Lepcha have with the rivers. At Jogja, during the Biennale, at the residency, she would have intense intuitive connection with the local spirits there, which would manifest in the form of goosebumps all around her body. And her way of telling these stories is actually by making an artwork. Acknowledging experience like these is a form of resistance. There are such links that the artist seemed more spiritual than happenstance. And in this way, contemporary art practice could relate to our realities and enrich our understanding of sharing histories beyond the lens of nationalism, capitalism, archive, or ethnography by centering lived experience over theory. Isn't it time that we decolonize Anthropocene? For Lepcha and many indigenous communities, hydropower dams are not development projects. It is suffocating. The dams are killing their ancestors. So when the flood rushed down Teesta River recently at Sikkim, and the parts of the dam was washed away, for Lepcha people, it was meant to be, to restore the balance of the nature. Dear Makasi, how do we address the insecurities, feelings of inferiority, and anxiety that often accompany participating in art events while understanding the roots of imposter syndrome? Care should not be limited to the creation and presentation of art. It should also shape our approach to the dynamics inherent in the art spaces. These challenges require collective effort to establish spaces within the art community that prioritize mutual supports and understanding, addressing lingering insecurities. And also, most importantly, develop the practice of self-accountability. Dear Makasi, like yourself, I am also frustrated. I'm frustrated with the patriarch elders. In one hand, they are knowledge holder while they also keep on perpetuating the problematic binaries, the normatives, and the neurotypical values. This complex situation is true in different spectrums, also in other communities like Sami and Maori in the Pacifics. Yes, we're burnt out, we're tired of struggling actively, not only with the system, but also among the people we love and respect. Dear Makasi, you know better that most of the family functions are contested times. These events perpetuate the expectation to conform to patriarchal rituals and to sacrifice the individual liberties for the sake of one's community. Weddings are such events which covers up deeper gendered conflict. In the face of celebrations, glitters, and parties. Few days back, I attended such wedding. According to the ritual, we went to drop off the bride at her husband's village. After traveling for 10 hours on road and walking straight uphill for 2 hours in 1,700 meters above the sea level, because there are no roads to the village. And by the way, this sea level is quite average in the context of Nepal. After complaining about the gendered jewelry and the dress I had to wear while men were rocking their comfortable pants, and after cursing my own big fat ass to be so anti-gravity, and it was slowing me down. We reached the village, and in instances like this, I get reality check that how privileged I am. It's actually not just because my community and the place I'm born in, Kathmandu, was later converted into the capital of Nepal after the colonization by the Shaha kings. But it's also because, unlike other indigenous community who were converted forcefully, who were pushed forcefully into the caste system, my community sometimes, in some point, assimilated into the caste system. Sometimes they were forcefully assimilated, and sometimes there are histories of genocide where we were compelled to adopt different religion. For example, for most of the indigenous shrines, there are 3 names. One in Buddhism, one in Hinduism, and one in indigenous language. For the rain god and agricultural god, we have 3 names: Karunamaya in Buddhism, Machindranath in Hinduism, and Ajudaya in Newa indigenous language. Ajudaya means grandfather god. But because of the state-sponsored, because Nepal used to be Hindu country, and it still is in a way, Machindranath is the most popular name. So these are the losses we're facing. In the entire journey to the village, there was a glimmer of inspiration though. We were greeted by a dancing elderly person. In front of the groom's house, Chama, who was rocking her kajol mustache and recycled hat, this ancient form of drag is particularly performed by elderly women during weddings. And this might have been continued from hundreds of years across multiple communities. I don't have the confidence as you do, Chama. I don't have it. I can't bear multiple pairs of eye gazing at me. But next time we meet, I want to dance with you. Dear Makasi, dear Chama, dear Dankini, dear Boksi, dear Ajima, dear all the untamable spirits, I want to dance with you. I want to dance along with you. I would also like to shout out to the individuals and to the groups and to the collectives who are creating safer spaces for the people who can't come out in the public. I also acknowledge them for simultaneously making awareness in the very public spaces and reclaiming those spaces. Makasi, our shared connections must extend beyond our trauma as a sole point of solidarity, a commitment to mutual care. This commitment to mutual care should not just be a survival necessity. Can we imagine a space where we rest? And rest is not a privilege. And we celebrate the possibility of solace. And when we actually build solidarity that are authentic and are aware of the power differences within our communities as well. Thank you.